Hello, and welcome. Tonight, we drift back to medieval Europe, a time when the line between law and bizarre street theater was wonderfully, and often painfully, blurred. This was an era where justice wasn't just blind, it was creatively cruel, and your punishment was often designed to be a memorable public performance. The goal wasn't just to correct your behavior, but to make sure your neighbors had a good story to tell for weeks to come. So, find a comfortable position and let the world outside begin to fade. Before we begin our descent into the strange annals of justice, if you enjoy these quiet explorations of the past, please take a moment to subscribe to Medieval Nocturnes. Your support helps this channel continue its journey into the night. Let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. It's always a quiet pleasure to see how far these stories travel. Now, let the room grow dim and let the gentle hum of history begin. Imagine your worst night of overindulgence, perhaps a bit too much ale at the local tavern. In our time, it might earn you a headache and a stern look from a friend. But in medieval Europe, it could earn you a starring role in a humiliating local drama. Wearing a piece of fashion known as the drunkard's cloak. This wasn't a cloak of fine wool or linen. It was a heavy, awkward beer barrel, repurposed into a walking prison of shame. It was the one garment guaranteed to cure you of public intoxication and possibly your will to ever leave the house again. The process was brutally simple. After your public display of poor judgment, perhaps you tried to teach a horse to sing, or mistook the town well for a confidant. The local authorities would decide a lesson was in order. This lesson came in the form of an empty wooden cask, with a hole cut in the top for your head, and two more on the sides for your arms. You were unceremoniously fitted inside, the wood pressing against your shoulders, your movement restricted to a clumsy, shuffling gait. Suddenly, you weren't a person anymore. You were a public service announcement on legs. Then came the parade. This was the centerpiece of the punishment. You would be forced to waddle through the town's main streets, your every step a clumsy, hollow thud. The faint, sour smell of stale ale or pickled fish from the barrel's previous life would be your constant companion. Children would point and laugh. Vendors would pause to watch the spectacle, and the town gossips would gather fresh material. The goal was pure, unadulterated humiliation, and in that, it was a resounding success. In some German towns, this device was known as the Schandmäntel, or coat of shame, and its use wasn't limited to just drunkards. It was a versatile tool for punishing petty thieves, habitual blasphemers, or even musicians who played their instruments with more passion than skill. The weight of the oak barrel was a constant, tiring burden, while the jeers of the crowd were a heavy weight on the spirit. It was a punishment that attacked your dignity far more than your body. When your sentence was finally over and the barrel was lifted from your aching shoulders, the relief would be immense, but the experience lingered. This was considered a mild punishment in the grand hierarchy of medieval justice. No broken bones, no branding, just a very, very bad day. Yet, as you walked home, sore and humbled, you'd have to wonder if that last pint of ale was truly worth the price of becoming the town's walking, talking barrel of laughs. If the drunkard's cloak was the medieval world's answer to a walk of shame, the cucking stool was its more aquatic, and arguably more shocking, counterpart. This was a punishment designed not just for a moment of poor judgment, but for a perceived flaw in one's character. It was the tool of choice for dealing with a common scold, a wonderfully vague term that could be applied to anyone, but most often women accused of gossiping, arguing, or generally disrupting the quiet, patriarchal order of the town. The device itself was a marvel of simple, humiliating engineering. It consisted of a sturdy wooden chair, sometimes little more than a plank with a back attached to the end of a long pole. This pole was mounted on a pivot like a giant seesaw and typically placed at the edge of a river, pond, or even the town's moat. The purpose was not just to seat the offender, but to dunk them repeatedly and publicly into the cold and often disgustingly dirty water below. The ordeal began not at the water's edge, but with a parade. The condemned was strapped firmly into the chair, which was often mounted on wheels for this very purpose. They were then rolled through the town, a mobile spectacle designed to gather a crowd and build anticipation. People would emerge from their homes and workshops to follow the procession. Their morbid curiosity piqued. This preliminary tour ensured that by the time the stool reached its destination, the audience was primed and ready for the main event. At the riverbank, the long arm of the cucking stool would be swung out over the water, suspending the terrified victim over the murky depths. The operator, often the town jailer, would wait for a dramatic pause, letting the tension build. Then, with a sharp, downward push on his end of the lever, the chair would plunge its occupant into the water. The shock of the cold, the sudden inability to breathe, and the roar of the crowd would create a moment of pure, disorienting terror. You would be brought up, gasping for air, only to be plunged back down again. The number of dunks was often decided on the spot, depending on the severity of the scolding or the mood of the crowd. The official justification for this punishment was that it would cool the temper of the offender. A quaint piece of medieval psychology that equated a sharp tongue with a fever that only dirty river water could cure. It was, in essence, a forced baptism of public shame. While the cucking stool is famously associated with women, men were not entirely exempt from its embrace. A dishonest merchant who used false weights, a baker who sold bread filled with more air than flour, or a brewer whose ale was weak, could also find themselves taking an involuntary and very public bath. For them, it was a punishment that washed away not sin, but their professional credibility, often to the delight of their disgruntled customers. Once the authorities and the crowd were satisfied, you would be unstrapped and left to stumble home, dripping, shivering, and utterly degraded. Your clothes would be ruined, your body chilled to the bone, but the deepest chill came from the memory of the jeering faces and the cold, indifferent water. The cucking stool was a powerful reminder that in medieval society, speaking out of turn could leave you quite literally silenced and gasping for breath. From the crime of speaking too much, we now turn to the offense of sounding truly awful. In an age before headphones and noise complaints, medieval towns had their own unique solution for dealing with disturbances of the peace, especially those of a musical nature. If your lute playing made the local dogs howl in agony, or your singing voice could curdle milk, you might find yourself sentenced to wear the shame flute, or shandflate, as it was known in German-speaking lands. This device was a masterpiece of ironic punishment. It looked, from a distance, like a very large, very clumsy woodwind instrument. Forged from heavy iron, it had the rough shape of a flute or a clarinet, but this was no tool for creating music. It was a cruel parody, a metal sculpture designed to be locked around a person's neck, with a connecting bar that clamped their hands in a fixed mock-playing position. It was an instrument whose only product was profound, silent humiliation. The primary targets were, of course, dreadful musicians, the kind of minstrels whose performances were so bad they were considered a form of public assault. But the shame flute's application could be broader. A person who sang Bodhi songs too loudly after curfew, someone who constantly shouted and argued in the market, or even a town crier who was deemed too annoying could be sentenced to wear it. The crime wasn't just making music, it was making any sound that grated on the nerves of the community and its leaders. The punishment was a slow, agonizing performance. Once locked into the contraption, you were paraded through the town square. The iron collar would chafe your neck, and the weight of the device would make your arms and shoulders ache. Your fingers would be trapped against the cold metal, frozen in the posture of a musician about to play a masterpiece. But you could make no sound, offer no defense, and do nothing but endure the stares and taunts of your fellow citizens. The public, naturally, played their part with cruel enthusiasm. They would treat the spectacle like a genuine concert, offering mock applause and shouting sarcastic requests. "Play us the one about the miller's lazy son," someone might yell, followed by a chorus of laughter. The experience was designed to be a total sensory inversion. You, who had filled the air with unwanted noise, were now the center of a silent, deeply personal torment, surrounded by the very sounds of public mockery you had once inflicted on others. The true genius of the shame flute was its perfect biting irony. It was a punishment that fit the crime with poetic cruelty. Your instrument of noise had become your prison of silence. It rendered your hands, the source of your offending music, completely useless. The device forced you to publicly embody your failure, turning your passion into a visible symbol of your incompetence and lack of consideration for your neighbors. When the flute was finally unlocked and removed, your relief would be tempered by a deep, lasting embarrassment. You were left not only with a sore neck and bruised fingers, but with a new public identity, the person who had to wear the fake flute. The lesson was deeply ingrained. In medieval Europe, if you were going to perform in public, you had better be good. Otherwise, the town might just provide you with an instrument you would never, ever forget. While the shame flute silenced unwanted noise with mockery, another device aimed for a more direct, and arguably more brutal, form of quiet. This instrument of control was reserved for the power of the spoken word, specifically for those whose words were deemed disruptive, dishonest, or defiant. It was known as the Branks bridle, or sometimes the scold's bridle, and it was a punishment designed not just to stop speech, but to make the very act of trying to speak a painful one. Imagine a helmet forged not for protection, but for subjugation. The bridle was an intricate cage of iron bands and plates, hinged to fit snugly over a person's entire head. A lock at the back secured it in place, making it impossible for the wearer to remove. From a distance, it might look like a strange, ornate piece of headgear. Up close, however, its cruel purpose became terrifyingly clear. It was a mask of silence, forced upon you by the will of the community. But the true horror of the bridle was a small, sinister detail hidden from casual view. A flat plate of metal, known as a bit or gag, was attached to the inside of the mask. This plate, often roughened or even studded with a sharp spike, was inserted into the mouth to press firmly down upon the tongue. This made speech impossible. To even attempt to move your tongue to form a word was to invite a sharp, agonizing pain. The silence it created was absolute and enforced by the threat of self-inflicted injury. Like the cucking stool, the bridle was the designated tool for punishing the scold, a term almost exclusively applied to women. A woman accused of gossiping, nagging her husband, spreading rumors, or publicly challenging the authority of a town official could find herself sentenced to wear this iron cage. It was a visceral tool of patriarchal control, a way of physically enforcing the period's expectation that women should be quiet, submissive, and certainly not disruptive. Once caged within the bridle, the victim was subjected to a final layer of humiliation. A public walk. They would be led through the town's busiest streets, often by a chain attached to a ring on the bridle, forcing them to walk like a leashed animal. People would stop and stare, some with pity, others with scorn. The victim could offer no explanation, no cry for help, no protest. They were reduced to a silent, walking spectacle of shame, their identity temporarily erased by the iron mask they wore. To amplify the degradation, some bridles were crafted with deliberately grotesque features. A long metal snout might be added to imply the wearer was a pig rooting for gossip. Bells were sometimes attached to the frame, their cheerful jingling creating a sickening contrast with the wearer's silent suffering and ensuring no one in the vicinity could miss the shameful procession. Every detail was calculated to strip away dignity and humanity. When the ordeal was over and the key was turned, the bridle would be removed, leaving the wearer physically unharmed but psychologically scarred. The silence it imposed was temporary, but the memory of being paraded as a voiceless, dehumanized object was permanent. The Brank's bridle was more than a punishment. It was a tool designed to break the spirit, a chilling reminder that in medieval Europe, an opinionated voice could be considered a crime worthy of an iron cage. The punishments we have explored so far were for people whose guilt, in the eyes of the community, was already decided. But what happened when there was doubt? When one person's word was pitted against another's with no clear proof? In medieval Europe, a lack of evidence wasn't a roadblock to justice. It was an invitation for a much higher power to weigh in. This was the world of the trial by ordeal, a process where guilt or innocence was determined not by a jury, but by divine intervention. The logic, at least to the medieval mind, was deceptively simple. It was believed that God, being all-knowing and just, would not stand by and allow an innocent person to be wrongfully punished. Therefore, subjecting an accused person to a dangerous, painful test would reveal God's will. If they emerged miraculously unharmed or healed with impossible speed, they were innocent. If they suffered as any normal person would, their guilt was confirmed. The courtroom, in these cases, became the unpredictable realm of divine judgment itself. One of the most common forms was the ordeal of hot iron. In this test, the accused was required to carry a piece of glowing red-hot iron for a set number of paces, usually 9 feet. The ordeal would often take place inside a church, the sacred setting intended to amplify the presence of God. The searing heat and the smell of burning flesh were only the beginning of the test. The true verdict came later. After the iron was dropped, the burned hand was immediately bandaged by a priest, the dressings sealed with the church's official seal. The accused was then left to wait for 3 agonizing days. On the 3rd day, the priest would unwrap the wound in a solemn public ceremony. If it was found to be healing cleanly, without signs of infection, it was declared a miracle, divine proof of innocence. If, as was almost always the case in an era without antibiotics. The wound was festering. The person's guilt was considered proven beyond any doubt. Then there was the ordeal of cold water, a method with a terrifyingly paradoxical outcome. The accused, usually bound hand and foot, was lowered into a body of water that had been blessed by a priest. The community would gather at the riverbank or pond's edge to watch. If the person floated, they were declared guilty. The reasoning was that the pure, holy water was symbolically rejecting their sinful soul, refusing to accept them into its embrace. The alternative was even grimmer. If the accused sank, they were deemed innocent, as the blessed water had accepted them. Of course, being bound, they were often unable to save themselves. Officials were supposed to pull them out quickly, but accidents were frequent, and many an innocent person proved their lack of guilt only by drowning. It was a bizarre system where a posthumous acquittal was a very real and very final possibility. These trials were not about evidence. They were about faith, fear, and public spectacle. For serious crimes like treason, heresy, or murder, where the stakes were highest and proof was scarcest, it was a terrifying gamble with one's body as the stake, a system where the verdict depended not on facts, but on the hope of a miracle. Whether guilt was decided by divine ordeal or by the more mundane testimony of a neighbor, the sentence that followed often brought the offender right back into the public eye. For those found guilty of crimes against the community's trust, the punishment was designed to be as visible as possible, and few places in the medieval world were more public or more profoundly humiliating than the pillory. Think of it as medieval Europe's community notice board, but instead of posting news or edicts, the town posted a person. The pillory was a simple but brutally effective wooden structure, a set of hinged boards with holes for the head and hands, mounted on a post. Alongside its cousin, the stocks, which held the feet, it was a fixture in nearly every market square. Its placement was deliberate, right in the center of town, where commerce, gossip, and daily life converged. The crimes that earned you this uncomfortable honor were usually those that threatened the social fabric. A baker who sold underweight loaves, a merchant caught using false measures, a brewer who watered down his ale. These were offenses against the public good. Slanderers, perjurers, and those guilty of minor public disturbances could also find themselves locked in place, forced to contemplate their actions while serving as a living lesson to everyone who passed by. Once secured in the pillory, you were utterly helpless. Your head was pushed forward, your hands were trapped, and your body was held in a permanently stooped and awkward position. You could not swat away the flies that buzzed around your face. You could not shield your eyes from the glaring sun or the biting wind. For the duration of your sentence, which could last for hours or even days, your entire existence was confined to that small, unforgiving frame of wood. The true punishment, however, came not from the device itself, but from the crowd it attracted. Being in the pillory was an open invitation for public scorn. This was justice as a spectator sport. Your friends, neighbors, and customers were now your judges and tormentors. They were free and often encouraged to express their disapproval. If you were lucky, this came in the form of verbal insults and jeers. More often, it was physical. People would throw whatever was at hand. Rotten fruit and vegetables from the market stalls were a common choice. Mud, animal dung, and the general filth from the street were also popular projectiles. The assault was relentless, and you were unable to defend yourself. Each splat of a rotten tomato was not just an indignity, It was a physical manifestation of the community's collective disgust. The primary goal here was not to cause serious injury, though bruises and broken teeth were not uncommon. The aim was a form of social death. The pillory stripped you of your dignity, your standing, and your name, replacing it with the simple, shameful label of a criminal. When you were finally released, stiff, sore, and covered in filth, you were free to walk away. But you could never truly escape the memory of the public's contempt. If the pillory forced you to stand still and endure your shame, other punishments were designed to put that shame in motion. Medieval justice, ever theatrical, occasionally decided that a simple punishment was not enough. It needed a sense of spectacle, a flair for the dramatic. In some parts of Europe, this led to the creation of a truly bizarre device that combined physical pain with public performance, the whipping carousel. This was not a carousel in the joyful, fairground sense we know today. It was a grim piece of machinery, typically a large, rotating pillar or wooden platform set up in the town square. Offenders were stripped to the waist and tied securely to the post, their backs exposed and their hands bound. Once they were in place, the device would be set in motion by a guard or official, beginning to turn slowly, like a morbid merry-go-round of misery. The rotation served two distinct and cruel purposes. First, it ensured that every member of the gathered crowd had an equal, unobstructed view of the punishment. Justice, in this sense, was distributed to the audience in a full 360 degrees. No one could complain of a bad seat for this particular show. It transformed a personal punishment into a shared community experience, where every angle of the victim's suffering was made visible. Second, it made the whipper's job remarkably efficient. The official tasked with delivering the lashes didn't need to walk around the victim. They could simply stand in one spot, whip or birch rod in hand, and deliver the blows as the offender was slowly and mechanically rotated toward them. It was a chilling example of medieval problem-solving, applying the principles of mechanics to the methodical infliction of pain. A ride on the whipping carousel was reserved for offenses deemed a step above petty misconduct. Repeated thieves, fraudsters, and those accused of public blasphemy might find themselves sentenced to this spinning ordeal. The goal was twofold: to inflict a painful physical penalty and to create a powerful, unforgettable deterrent. The spectacle of a person being simultaneously whipped and rotated was not something a witness would easily forget. The atmosphere surrounding the event was often disturbingly festive. The slow, rhythmic creak of the turning wood, the sharp crack of the whip against skin, and the cries of the victim all blended into the day's public theater. For the audience, it was a raw and visceral form of entertainment, where the moral of the story was written in welts on the victim's back. It was a clear message about the consequences of defying social and legal norms. When the carousel finally creaked to a halt and the victim was cut down, the physical wounds were only part of the story. The deeper punishment was the memory of spinning helplessly before the eyes of their entire community, a slow, revolving testament to their crime. It was proof that in medieval Europe, your shame wasn't just put on display. Sometimes, it was put into rotation for everyone to see. While some punishments involved motion and spectacle, others mastered the art of torment through agonizing stillness. These were devices designed to inflict a slow, grinding pain that grew more intense with every passing minute of public display. One of the most infamous of these was a deceptively simple contraption known as the wooden donkey, or sometimes the Spanish donkey. This was no child's plaything. The wooden donkey was a long, triangular beam of wood, with its top edge sharpened to a severe, punishing angle, like a narrow wedge. This beam was then mounted on legs, giving it the rough profile of a horse or donkey, and it would be placed in the town square, awaiting its unfortunate rider. Its purpose was singular and cruel: to inflict immense pressure on a small, sensitive area of the human body. The offender was sentenced to ride the donkey. They were lifted and placed astride the sharp wooden back, as if mounting a horse. Instantly, the entire weight of their body was concentrated onto the narrow, unforgiving apex of the beam. The pain was immediate, sharp, and excruciating. A crushing pressure that seemed designed by someone with a deep understanding of human anatomy and an even deeper well of cruelty. As if this experience weren't agonizing enough, the punishment was often intensified. To increase the pressure, heavy weights, such as large stones or iron blocks, were chained to the victim's ankles. The added weight pulled their body down harder onto the sharp edge, escalating the pain from merely torturous to truly unbearable. Each added stone was another layer of calculated misery, ensuring the lesson was deeply and painfully learned. This particular punishment was a favorite within military circles for disciplining disobedient or cowardly soldiers, but its use was not confined to the barracks. Civilians found guilty of various offenses could also be sentenced to a ride. In some places, it was used to punish those who cheated in business. In others, it was a penalty for perceived moral failings. The slow, grinding nature of the pain was thought to be a fitting penance for stubborn offenders. And like so many medieval punishments, this was a public performance. The crowd would gather around the wooden donkey, not with pity, but with morbid curiosity and a taste for cruel entertainment. The victim's groans of pain were met with jeers and laughter. Any shift in posture to try and find a moment of relief was impossible, and their suffering was the day's main event. It was a spectacle that turned profound agony into public theater. The wooden donkey was not just humiliating, it was genuinely dangerous. The intense, prolonged pressure could cause severe and lasting internal injuries. When the victim was finally lifted off the device after their sentence was served, they would often be unable to walk, their body racked with pain. It was a brutal lesson in obedience, delivered by an instrument of justice that offered no mercy, no comfort, and no escape from its sharp, unyielding edge. The punishments we have discussed so far, however brutal, were largely designed for the offender to survive, carrying their shame as a lesson. But for the most heinous crimes, medieval justice devised methods of execution that were not just fatal, but also deeply symbolic and psychologically terrifying. Among the most bizarre was a punishment with ancient Roman roots that persisted in some corners of Europe: pona colle, the penalty of the sack. This was not a sentence for a common thief or a public drunkard. Pona colle was the prescribed penalty for one of the most reviled crimes imaginable: parricide. This was the act of killing one's own father, mother, or another close blood relative, in a society built on the sacred bonds of family and patriarchal authority. This was a crime so unnatural that it was believed to demand an equally unnatural and terrifying end. The process began with a large, sturdy sack, typically sewn from tough leather or oxhide. The convicted person was brought forth, and after their sentence was read, they were forced into this dark, confining space. But they were not to face their final moments alone. This is where the punishment took a turn from merely cruel to the truly surreal, transforming a simple execution into a waking nightmare. Joining the condemned in the sack was a collection of live animals, a small, chaotic menagerie chosen for a grim purpose. The traditional companions for this final journey, as dictated by ancient law, were a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey. Each creature was carefully selected, not for its lethality, but for its powerful symbolic meaning, turning the execution into a dark, living parable. The symbolism was a form of grim poetry meant to reflect the nature of the crime. The dog was said to represent the betrayal of filial loyalty and duty. The rooster, whose crow greets the morning light, signified the profanity of a crime that belonged to the darkness. The viper was the clear embodiment of poison and treachery. And the monkey, seen as a grotesque parody of a human, was thought to represent the degradation of the human spirit required to commit such an act. Once this bizarre assembly of man and beast was securely sewn inside the airtight sack, the final stage began. The heavy bundle was carried to a nearby river or the sea and cast into the water. The death that followed was a chaotic confluence of horrors: suffocation in the dark, the terror of drowning, and the frantic bites, scratches, and hisses of the panicked animals trapped with them. It was a death designed to be as terrifying as possible. The penalty of the sack was an execution meant to be the ultimate horror. It was a punishment that denied a grave, a final peace, and even a moment of solitary contemplation. It was a powerful statement from the authorities that for a crime that struck at the very heart of the natural order, the offender's end would be an immersion in pure, unnatural chaos, erased from the world in the company of beasts. If the penalty of the sack was an execution shrouded in the dark chaos of myth and symbolism, other methods of justice were far more direct. They turned the act of punishment into a slow, methodical, and brutally visible spectacle for the entire community to witness. We now arrive at one of history's most notorious instruments of severe corporal punishment and execution, the breaking wheel. Despite its fearsome reputation, the device itself was often nothing more than a large, heavy wagon wheel, the kind one might see on any farm cart. This familiar, everyday object was taken from its ordinary context and transformed into an altar of public punishment. The wheel would be laid flat upon a scaffold or sometimes mounted on a central axis, ready for its grim and theatrical purpose in the town square. The condemned person was brought before the crowd and forcibly stretched out across the wheel. Their arms and legs were tied securely to the sturdy wooden spokes, positioning their limbs over the gaps between them. Pinned to the instrument of their own destruction, they were made completely vulnerable, a living display of the state's absolute power over the individual body. Then, the executioner would begin their terrible work, wielding a heavy iron bar, or sometimes a wooden club. They would deliver a series of calculated, powerful blows to the victim's limbs. The gaps between the spokes of the wheel allowed the bones to snap and shatter cleanly under the force of the impact. The process was methodical and chillingly precise. Shins, then femurs, then forearms, then upper arms, each broken in turn. The cruelty of the sentence could be finely tuned by the presiding magistrate. For some, a merciful sentence might be ordered, where, after a certain number of blows, the executioner would deliver a final, fatal strike to the chest or neck, known as the coup de grâce, or blow of mercy. In more severe cases, this was explicitly forbidden. The sentence was to be broken completely, but left alive to suffer. After the breaking, the victims shattered. Unnaturally pliable limbs were often woven through the spokes of the wheel, creating a grotesque and horrifying tableau. The wheel was then hoisted to the top of a tall pole, raising the broken but often still living person high above the crowd. There they would remain, a horrifying spectacle against the sky, exposed to the sun, the cold, and the predatory birds. The breaking wheel was more than a method of execution. It was a message burned into the collective memory of the community. It was reserved for the most heinous of criminals, brutal murderers, traitors, and highwaymen. Its purpose was to demonstrate the terrifying power of the law and to instill a deep, visceral fear in the hearts of all who witnessed it. It was a slow, agonizing, and very public end, designed to be remembered for a lifetime. From the horrifying, stationary spectacle of the breaking wheel, we turn to a punishment that was far more common and mobile. While the wheel was reserved for the most depraved criminals, lesser offenders could face a sentence that brought their shame directly to the doorstep of every citizen. This was the grimly practical punishment of being whipped at the cart's tail. The concept was straightforward. It was a parade of pain and humiliation. Instead of bringing the public to a single location like a pillory or scaffold, this method brought the punishment directly to the public. It transformed the entire town into a sprawling theater of justice, ensuring that no one, from the wealthiest merchant to the humblest washerwoman, could claim to have missed the day's stern lesson. The ordeal began when the convicted person, often stripped to the waist to expose their back, was tied by their wrists to the rear of a simple wooden cart. A town official, such as a beadle or constable, would walk behind them, carrying the whip, typically a caddo, ninetails, or a bundle of birch rods. At a signal, the cart driver would urge his horse forward, beginning a slow, deliberate procession through the town's streets. The route was never chosen at random. It was carefully planned for maximum public exposure, winding past the market square, down the high street, and by the steps of the main church. At key intersections, a bell might be rung or a town crier would loudly announce the name of the offender and the nature of their crime, drawing residents to their windows and doorways to witness the mobile spectacle. As the cart rumbled slowly over the uneven cobblestones, the official would administer the lashes at prescribed intervals. The slow, steady pace of the cart meant there was no escape. The victim had to stumble along, enduring not only the sharp sting of the whip, but also the grueling physical effort of keeping pace, all while being bound to the moving vehicle. It was a punishment that combined pain, exhaustion, and public degradation in equal measure. This sentence was often reserved for repeat petty thieves, vagrants, and those found guilty of public immorality. For vagrants, in particular, it served a dual purpose. It was both a punishment and a brutal form of eviction, as the procession often ended at the town limits, where the bloodied individual was cast out and warned never to return. The pain and the very public shame were a powerful deterrent. Whipping at the cart's tail was a grimly efficient form of mobile justice. It required no special equipment beyond a cart and a whip, yet it guaranteed that the criminal's suffering and shame would be witnessed by the entire community. It was a rolling, public declaration that the social order would be maintained, delivered one painful step and one stinging lash at a time, while a whipping at the cart's tail was a swift, violent, and mobile event. Other punishments were designed for a slower, more constant form of humiliation. These were not about a single parade of pain, but but about forcing an offender to wear their shame every minute of every day, an inescapable accessory to their crime. A prime example of this philosophy was the iron collar. This was not jewelry, but its grim opposite. The iron collar was a heavy, unforgiving ring of forged metal, hinged on one side and secured on the other with a lock. Once fastened around the neck, it was cold, cumbersome, and impossible to remove without the aid of a blacksmith and the key held by the authorities. Its sheer weight was a constant, nagging physical reminder of the wearer's transgression. The basic collar was humiliating enough, but many were embellished for maximum public effect. Some had a long chain attached, tethering the wearer to a public post or a whipping stone in the town square, turning them into a temporary living monument to bad behavior. Others had bells affixed, which would jingle with every movement, drawing unwanted attention and preventing any attempt at anonymity. Perhaps the most direct form of this punishment was the collar that was literally engraved with the nature of the crime. A single word, thief, liar, or blasphemer, would be stamped into the metal for all to see. This transformed the wearer into a walking billboard of their own dishonor, forced to silently announce their sin to every person they passed on the street. It was a confession forged in iron. The collar was typically reserved for crimes that broke the delicate bonds of social trust. A merchant who consistently cheated his customers, a person known for spreading malicious gossip, or a petty thief caught for the first time might be sentenced to wear it. It was a punishment designed not for violent criminals, but for those who had poisoned the well of community relations through dishonesty or disruption. The true torment of the iron collar was its longevity. A sentence in the pillory might last a day, but a sentence to wear the collar could last for weeks, or in some cases, months. During this time, the wearer had to attempt to go about their daily life. Eating was awkward, sleeping was a constant challenge, and every simple task was complicated by the heavy iron ring. But worse than any physical discomfort was the constant, silent judgment from everyone they encountered. When the sentence was finally served and a blacksmith was summoned to unlock the collar, the physical relief would be immense. But the mark it left was more than just a raw patch of skin on the neck. The iron collar was a tool for temporarily rewriting a person's identity, ensuring that for a long and miserable period they were known not by their name but by the crime they were forced to wear. The shame of the iron collar, however heavy, was temporary. A blacksmith's key could eventually set you free from its cold embrace. But medieval justice possessed other, far more permanent solutions for dealing with certain crimes. For offenders who used their hands to steal, the law sometimes decreed a punishment that was swift, irreversible, and served as a lifelong, visible warning: amputation. The philosophy behind this punishment was chillingly straightforward. If a hand was used to steal, then in the eyes of the law, the hand itself was the offending instrument. To remove it was to permanently remove the person's ability to commit that same crime again. It was a literal and brutal interpretation of justice, aimed not at rehabilitation, but at incapacitation. The goal was to both punish the individual and to create a walking advertisement for the severe consequences of theft. This was not a sentence handed down lightly for a single, desperate act. Amputation was typically reserved for habitual thieves, for burglars caught breaking into a home, or for those who stole items of significant value such as livestock, religious relics from a church, or a nobleman's horse. The permanence of the punishment was meant to match the gravity of the crime and the threat the offender posed to the community's property. The act itself was a grim public spectacle performed in the town square for all to see. The convicted thief would be brought to a wooden block, their offending hand or arm forced down upon it. The sentence was often carried out not by a specialized executioner, but by a blacksmith or even a butcher, someone whose daily work involved the necessary tools and a strong stomach. A single, swift blow from a heavy axe or cleaver was all it took. Surviving the immediate procedure was only the first challenge. The wound was usually cauterized on the spot with a red-hot iron or boiling pitch to stop the bleeding. A secondary wave of agony that was, nonetheless, a life-saving measure. Even so, in an age without antibiotics or an understanding of germs, the risk of a fatal infection in the following days and weeks was incredibly high. The sentence of losing a hand could very easily become an agonizing death sentence. For those who did survive, a new life of immense hardship began. The loss of a hand was a permanent, visible brand of criminality. It made most forms of manual labor the primary source of income for the vast majority of the population nearly impossible. You were marked for life, an immediate object of suspicion and fear, your past crime visible to every stranger, potential employer, and neighbor you met. Ultimately, amputation turned a person into a living cautionary tale. Their very presence in the community served as a silent, powerful sermon on the high price of theft. They were a permanent, walking reminder that in the world of medieval justice, some sentences were not just served for a time, but were carried, physically and socially, for the rest of one's life. The loss of a hand was a brutal and unmistakable sign of a past crime, a permanent disability that reshaped a person's life. But for a wider range of offenses, medieval authorities employed a method that was less physically debilitating, yet no less permanent in its social consequences. This was the ancient and widespread practice of branding. Branding was the medieval equivalent of a permanent criminal record, but one that was written not on parchment, but directly onto the skin for all the world to see. The process was brutally simple. A specially forged iron, often shaped into a letter or symbol, was heated in a fire until it glowed red. It was then pressed firmly into the offender's flesh, searing a mark that would heal into a lifelong, indelible scar. The marks were not random. They were a code, a shorthand of shame that was instantly recognizable to the populace. A letter T might be burned onto the cheek or thumb of a convicted thief. An F could stand for framemaker, marking a known brawler or public agitator. A V for vagrant was often branded onto the shoulder or arm, serving as a permanent warning to any town the person might try to enter. This scar was a label you could never remove. The location of the brand was deliberately chosen for maximum visibility and humiliation. The cheek or forehead was the most severe placement, as it was impossible to hide and served as a constant source of public shame. The fleshy part of the thumb was also a common spot, visible every time the person handled money or offered a handshake. The goal was to ensure the mark could not be easily concealed by clothing or forgotten over time. This punishment was applied to a wide spectrum of criminals. Army deserters were often branded to prevent them from trying to re-enlist. Swindlers, perjurers, and those who cheated at cards might also receive a mark, signifying their dishonesty. It was a versatile tool of justice, a way to permanently flag an individual as untrustworthy to the community without resorting to mutilation or execution. Beyond the public shaming, branding served a grimly practical purpose for law enforcement. In a world without photography, detailed records, or a centralized justice system, the brand was a foolproof method for identifying a repeat offender. A magistrate in a new town could know a person's criminal history with a single glance, making it incredibly difficult for a branded individual to ever truly escape their past. Branding was a sentence that truly lasted a lifetime. An offender could serve their time in the stocks. They could even move to a new village and change their name, but the scar remained. It was a silent witness to their past misdeeds, a permanent whisper of their crime that would follow them to the grave. Justice, in this form, was quite literally skin deep. The permanent marks of branding and amputation were punishments for serious criminals. But for the ultimate crime in the medieval world, high treason, the state devised a penalty of unparalleled complexity and horror. This was not merely an execution, it was a state-sponsored theatrical performance of total annihilation, designed to serve as the most terrifying warning imaginable. This was the infamous sentence of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. High treason was considered the most heinous offense a person could commit. It was not a crime against an individual, but an attack on the monarch, the kingdom, and what was believed to be God's chosen order on earth. To betray the king was to challenge the very structure of society and divine will. Therefore, the punishment had to be more than just death. It had to be the complete and symbolic destruction of the traitor. The brutal ritual began with the drawing. The condemned was not permitted to walk to their execution. Instead, they were tied to a wooden hurdle, a simple frame like a fence panel, and dragged by a horse through the rough, filthy streets. This journey, from their prison cell to the public gallows, was the first act of their degradation, a slow, painful procession that ensured they arrived bruised, battered, and humbled before the waiting crowd. Upon arrival at the scaffold, the second act commenced, the hanging. The traitor was strung up by a rope, but this was not intended to be a swift or fatal drop. The purpose was to strangle them only to the brink of death. After a period of agonizing suffocation, they were cut down while still alive, gasping for breath, conscious enough to witness the final, most gruesome part of their sentence. What followed next was the culmination of the state's methodical revenge. While still alive, the traitor was publicly disemboweled. Their internal organs were then often burned on a fire before their own eyes. This horrific act was deeply symbolic, representing a purification by fire of their inner corruption and treasonous thoughts. Finally, the executioner would use an axe to behead the individual and dismember their body into 4 pieces. This was the quartering. Yet, even this was not the end. The traitor's severed head was typically preserved in tar and mounted on a spike in a highly visible public place, such as on the gates of London Bridge, where it served as a constant, grisly reminder. The 4 quarters of their body were dispatched to different cities across the kingdom, to be displayed above the main gates as a widespread and unambiguous message to any who might contemplate a similar betrayal. The sentence of being hanged, drawn, and quartered was the ultimate expression of royal power. It was a methodical process of dehumanization designed to erase the traitor not just from life, but from memory as anything other than a symbol of failed rebellion. It was a punishment engineered to terrorize, to warn, and to ensure that the authority of the crown was understood to be absolute and its vengeance inescapable. The punishments of medieval Europe, from the pillory to the gallows, all shared a common, powerful thread: the importance of the public spectacle. Justice was a performance, and the shame or suffering of an individual was a lesson for the entire community. But to find the true masters of turning life and death into a form of mass entertainment, we must allow our journey to drift further back in time, leaving the muddy towns of the Middle Ages for the sun-baked stone and marble of an even older world, the Roman Empire. Here, in the heart of a civilization that prided itself on law, engineering, and military might, we find the arena. And in the arena, we find its most iconic figure, the gladiator. But the story of the gladiator does not begin with the roar of the Colosseum crowd or the gilded box of an emperor. It begins in a far quieter, more somber, and more intimate setting, a funeral. Long before these duels became Rome's favorite pastime, they were a solemn religious rite known as a munus, a duty or offering to the dead. In the early Roman Republic, when a powerful aristocrat died, his family would honor his memory by staging a duel between two combatants, often slaves or prisoners of war, right at the site of the funeral. This was not for sport, but for sacrifice. The early Romans held a deep-seated belief, likely inherited from their Etruscan neighbors, that human blood possessed a sacred power. They believed that the spilling of this vital fluid on the earth would appease the spirits of the underworld and honor the soul of the departed. A fight to the death at a graveside was the ultimate tribute, an offering of life force to accompany the deceased on their journey into the afterlife. But what began as a solemn duty soon revealed its potential for spectacle. The families staging these funeral rites noticed that the duels drew crowds of fascinated onlookers. Ambitious aristocrats quickly realized that the grander the funeral games, the more popular they became with the public. The focus began to slowly shift from honoring the dead to winning the favor and admiration of the living. By the time of the late Republic, these private funeral games had grown into massive public displays. Politicians and generals competed to outdo one another, staging ever more elaborate and bloody spectacles. When Julius Caesar held funeral games for his father, he did so on an unprecedented scale, featuring hundreds of gladiators in a multi-day event that dazzled the Roman populace and served as a masterful stroke of political theater. The blood that once flowed to appease the spirits of the dead, the transformation was complete. What started as a grim religious duty had evolved into the most popular and most politicized form of entertainment the world had ever seen. The stage was set for an empire to build its grandest monuments to the deadly art of the arena. While emperors and politicians used the games for glory and control, for the men who actually stepped onto the hot sand of the arena, life was a world of brutal discipline, fleeting fame, and the constant, looming shadow of death. So who were these gladiators, these paradoxical figures of Roman society, who were at once reviled as slaves and revered as heroes? The vast majority were not volunteers who chose this life. They were the unwilling and the unfortunate, swept into the arena by the relentless machinery of the Roman Empire. Many were prisoners of war, captured in distant campaigns in Germania, Dacia, or Gaul, their homelands crushed by the legions. Others were condemned criminals, sentenced not to a simple execution, but to die in the arena as a form of public entertainment, a sentence known as damnati ad deludum, and many more were simply slaves, purchased by an investor for their promising strength and physique. Once acquired, these men were sent to a gladiator school. These schools were formidable compounds, part prison and part high-intensity training camp. Enclosed by high walls and run with iron discipline by an owner known as a lanista. Here, a recruit's old identity was systematically stripped away. You were no longer a farmer, a soldier, or a craftsman. You were now a gladiator, your life defined by the sword, the shield, and the will of your master. Life inside the ludus was a relentless cycle of training. Days began early and were filled with grueling conditioning exercises to build the necessary stamina for a fight to the death. The core of their education, however, was endless weapon drills. Under the watchful eye of a trainer, a veteran gladiator who had survived long enough to teach, recruits would practice their footwork, strikes, and parries until they became pure muscle memory. Crucially, gladiators were not generic swordsmen. Each was trained to become a specialist in a particular, established fighting style, each with its own unique armor and set of weapons. One might be trained as a retiarius, a nimble fighter who used a net and trident, while another would become a heavily armored murmello. These distinct classes were deliberately designed to create dramatic and visually exciting matchups that would thrill the crowds in the arena. Despite their brutal existence, gladiators were incredibly valuable investments, and they were cared for accordingly. Their diet was carefully managed. A high-carbohydrate regimen, heavy on barley, beans, and vegetables that earned them the nickname horderi, or barleymen. This diet was designed to build body mass and a protective layer of subcutaneous fat. Medical care was also surprisingly advanced for the era, with skilled physicians on staff to set broken bones and stitch deep wounds. A dead trainee was a total financial loss. This created the central paradox of the gladiator's life. Legally, they were at the absolute bottom of the social ladder, branded with infamia, a status of deep public shame. Yet, in the eyes of the Roman people, a successful gladiator could achieve a level of celebrity that rivaled modern sports stars. They were slaves, but they were also heroes, living and dying in the harsh, unforgiving glare of the Roman sun. The brutal training, the specialized diet, the constant medical care, it was all in service of one moment. It all led to the arena, the grand and terrible theater where a gladiator's skill, courage, and luck were ultimately put to the test. And no stage in history was ever grander or more infamous than the Flavian amphitheater, known to the world as the Colosseum. This was the very heart of Rome's obsession with spectacle, a colossal ellipse of travertine stone and concrete. It could hold over 50,000 spectators, a roaring sea of humanity drawn from every class of Roman society, from the emperor himself down to the common plebeian. From the moment a spectator passed through one of its 80 arched entrances, they were stepping into a world meticulously designed to overwhelm the senses. The air on a game day was thick with a mixture of scents, roasting meats, and sweetened wine from the vendors. Fragrant incense burned to please the gods and mask the stench of blood and the dry, metallic temps of the sand below. The sound was a constant, deafening roar, the murmur of tens of thousands of conversations, the hawking of wares, all punctuated by the sharp blare of trumpets and the thunderous applause of an expectant crowd. A day at the arena was a carefully structured festival of violence. The morning was typically dedicated to the Venatians, the wild beast hunts, from hidden elevators and trapdoors in the arena floor. Exotic and dangerous creatures from the farthest corners of the empire would suddenly appear. Roaring lions from Africa, massive bears from the forests of Germania, and swift leopards from the east. Specially trained hunters, known as bestiarii, would then face them in a deadly display of skill and bravery. Midday was reserved for a grimmer spectacle: public executions. This was the time when condemned criminals, the Nocturnes, were brought into the arena to meet their end. These executions were often carried out in deliberately cruel and theatrical ways, serving as a horrifying intermission and a stark reminder to the populace of the absolute power of Roman law and the brutal consequences of defying it. Then, as the afternoon sun began to cast long shadows across the sand, the main event would finally begin. The gladiators would enter in a grand procession, the Pampa, marching in their gleaming, ornate armor, their weapons held high. They would circle the arena, saluting the emperor's box, sometimes uttering the legendary, if not universally used, phrase, Avenue Caesar morituri te salutant. Hail, Caesar, those who are about to die salute you. With the formalities complete, the trumpets would sound a final, sharp blast. A hush of anticipation would fall over the vast crowd. The gates to the arena would be sealed. The first pair of gladiators, carefully chosen for a dramatic matchup, would step forward to face each other on the blood-soaked sand. The show, for which they had bled and trained for so long, was about to begin. On the sand, under the intense gaze of 50,000 pairs of eyes, the fight began. But this was rarely a simple, chaotic clash of two men with swords. Roman gladiatorial combat was a highly regulated and tactical affair, more akin to a deadly ballet than a disorganized brawl. The key to its enduring appeal was the careful and deliberate pairing of distinct and contrasting fighting styles. Each gladiator was a specialist, an archetype with a specific set of armor, weapons, and tactics that they had mastered through years of training. The organizers of the games, the editors, would cast these fights like a director, pitting clashing styles against each other to generate the most tension and excitement for the audience. It was a contest of strength versus speed, of heavy defense versus nimble attack, of reach versus power. One of the most iconic figures was the Mirmillo. He was the heavyweight of the arena, heavily armed and armored in a style reminiscent of a Roman legionary. He carried a large, rectangular shield called a scutum, and wielded the short, brutally effective stabbing sword known as the gladius. His large helmet, often decorated with the image of a fish, protected his head and face, making him a slow-moving but formidable fortress of a man. Often pitted against the Mirmello was the Threx, or Thracian style fighter. He was a more agile combatant, styled after Rome's historic enemies from the Balkans. He carried a much smaller square shield that offered less protection but allowed for greater mobility, and he fought with a distinctive short, curved sword called a sica, designed specifically to hook around the edges of a larger shield and find gaps in an opponent's defense. Perhaps the most unusual and captivating of all gladiators was the resiarius, the net fighter. He was the minimalist of the arena, fighting almost bare-chested and without the protection of a helmet or a shield. His weapons were adapted from those of a fisherman, a weighted net to ensnare his opponent, a long, sharp trident to strike from a distance, and a small dagger, the pugio, for desperate close-quarters combat. He relied entirely on speed, agility, and precision. The retiarius's traditional and purpose-built opponent was the secutor, whose name meant the pursuer. He was designed from the ground up to defeat the net fighter. The secutor was heavily armored, but his most distinct feature was a smooth, egg-shaped helmet with only two tiny eye holes. This design offered maximum protection and, crucially, had no edges or crests for the net to snag on. allowing the secutor to relentlessly pursue his faster, more vulnerable foe. These carefully considered pairings turned each fight into a deadly chess match played out on the sand. Would the Retiarius manage to trap the lumbering secutor in his net, or would the pursuer's relentless advance prove too much? Would the Threx's curved blade find an opening in the Murmillo's stalwart defense? For the Roman crowd, this was the heart of the drama. Not just a fight to the death, but a clash of styles, a story told in sweat, sand, and blood. While the clash of styles and the courage of the combatants captivated the crowds, the true power of the arena lay not on the sand, but in the tiered seats that rose towards the sky. The games were never simply entertainment. They were one of the most sophisticated and effective political tools in the Roman world. An emperor who could stage a magnificent spectacle was an emperor who could command the loyalty of the masses. This political strategy was famously summed up by the poet Juvenal in the enduring phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses. He lamented that the Roman people, who had once held real political power, now cared for only two things: the free grain distributions that fed them, and the spectacular circus games that entertained them. By providing both, a ruler could keep the vast, potentially volatile population of Rome content, distracted, and politically passive. Staging these games was a colossally expensive undertaking. The logistics were staggering. Exotic animals had to be trapped and shipped from the furthest corners of the empire. Hundreds of gladiators had to be housed, fed, and trained, and the vast arenas themselves required constant maintenance. Only the emperor and the very wealthiest senators could afford such an outlay. Thus, every game was a powerful public declaration of the sponsor's immense wealth, influence, and generosity to the people. The games were also a potent tool of distraction. Was there bad news from a distant frontier? Had a plague broken out in the city's crowded tenements? Was the grain supply from Egypt delayed? A well-timed and dazzling series of games could skillfully divert public anger and anxiety, focusing the city's collective attention on the thrilling drama of the arena, instead of the pressing problems of the state. The emperor's box, or pulvinar, was the focal point of the entire Colosseum. From this elevated seat, he was not just a spectator, but the ultimate master of the show. He could grant a pardon to a crowd favorite, signal for a death blow, and respond to the people's cheers and petitions. It was a rare opportunity for direct and visible interaction between the absolute ruler and his subjects, allowing him to appear both magnanimous and all-powerful. However, this political blade could cut both ways. An emperor who appeared stingy, or who staged dull, uninspired games, could quickly earn the crowd's contempt. The roar of the Colosseum could turn from adulation to jeers in an instant, and a ruler who lost the affection of the arena crowd was in a politically precarious position. The voice of the people, expressed so loudly here, could not be easily ignored. In the end, the sand of the arena was a stage for imperial propaganda. The exotic beasts symbolized the vast reach of Roman dominion. The disciplined gladiators reinforced the ideal of Roman martial prowess. And the emperor, sitting above it all and deciding the fate of men with a simple gesture, was the living embodiment of the absolute power of the state. Blood was a political currency, and in the arena it was spent freely to purchase order and loyalty. When the clash of weapons finally ceased, and one gladiator stood victorious over his defeated but still living opponent, the fight itself was not yet over. In fact, the most dramatic moment of the entire spectacle was often about to unfold. The fate of the losing combatant now rested not in the hands of his opponent, but in the roaring will of the crowd and the final judgment of the person presiding over the games. The defeated gladiator, often wounded and exhausted, would typically drop his shield and weapon. He would then raise the forefinger of his left hand. This was the universal signal of surrender, the appeal ad digitum. It was a formal acknowledgement of defeat and a direct plea for missio, meaning release or reprieve. It was a request for his life to be spared so that he might recover and live to fight another day. Instantly, the entire arena would erupt in a cacophony of sound. The 50,000 spectators became a single, roaring judge and jury. If the defeated gladiator had fought with exceptional courage and skill, impressing the crowd with his bravery even in his loss, they would roar their approval. They would shout for him to be spared, waving white cloths or handkerchiefs in the air as a sign of their support. However, if the fighter had shown cowardice, incompetence, or a lack of fighting spirit, the crowd's reaction would be savage and merciless. They would scream for his death, jeering, whistling, and giving gestures of contempt. In the unforgiving moral code of the arena, a gladiator who failed to provide a worthy spectacle was seen as having forfeited his right to live. Mercy was not a gift. It was a prize to be earned through a display of valor. Modern films have cemented the image of a thumbs-down gesture, signaling death. The historical reality, however, is more complex and debated. The Latin phrase used in texts is pollis verso, which simply means with a turned thumb. Many historians now believe the death signal may have actually been a thumb pointed up. They meant to imitate the drawing of a sword, while the signal for mercy was a thumb tucked into a closed fist, symbolizing a sheathed weapon. While the crowd voiced its deafening opinion, the final binding decision belonged to the sponsor of the games, the editor, who was often the emperor himself. He would carefully read the mood of the people and then give his signal, though he held absolute authority to override their verdict. He would usually follow the crowd's desire in order to maintain his own popularity and appear responsive to his people. If the signal was for mercy, the defeated gladiator would rise and be allowed to limp from the arena, his life spared. If the signal was for death, the victor was honor-bound to carry out the sentence immediately, a final, swift blow to end the contest. For every gladiator who stepped onto the sand, this was the ultimate gamble, where the prize was not fame or fortune, but simply the chance to draw their next breath. To survive a duel in the arena, whether through a decisive victory or a grant of mercy from the crowd, was to earn another day of life. But what was that life actually like? Beyond the moments of terror and triumph on the sand, the gladiator occupied a strange and contradictory place in Roman society. A world defined by strict confinement, unexpected fame, and the ever-present shadow of death. When not preparing for the games, gladiators lived within the high walls of their ludas or school. Their existence was highly regimented, not unlike that of a soldier in a barracks. They ate together in a communal hall. They trained together in the practice yard, and they slept in small, shared cells. In this intense and isolated environment, strong bonds of camaraderie often formed. These men, who knew they might one day be forced to face each other in mortal combat, often became as close as brothers, sharing a unique and dangerous fate. Outside the walls of the school, the gladiator's status was a complex paradox. Legally, they were at the very bottom of the social hierarchy, branded with infamia, a formal status of dishonor that stripped them of most civil rights. Yet, in the eyes of the Roman public, they were superstars. Their names were scribbled as graffiti on city walls. Their victories were celebrated in poems, and their likenesses were captured in mosaics and on everyday objects like oil lamps. Children even played with small clay figurines of famous gladiators. This fame often took on a romantic and scandalous dimension. The gladiators' raw physical power and their daily proximity to death gave them a powerful aura of dangerous masculinity. They became objects of fascination and desire, and the whispered rumors of secret affairs between celebrated gladiators and wealthy, married noblewomen were a constant and thrilling source of gossip throughout the city of Rome. For every gladiator, however, the ultimate dream was not just fame or survival, but freedom. A fighter who consistently performed with exceptional skill and bravery over many years could, if he was very fortunate, be awarded the rudies. This was a simple wooden sword, a symbolic replica of their training weapon, but its meaning was profound. To be granted the rudies was to be granted a full discharge from service. It meant you were a free man again. A freed gladiator who had earned the rudies possessed a rare and valuable skill set. Many went on to become highly sought-after trainers in the gladiator schools, their fame and hard-won experience making them invaluable, if demanding, teachers. Some attempted to retire to a quiet life, but the transition from the deafening roar of the arena to the silence of civilian life was not always an easy one. They were free, but they were forever marked by their violent past. The gladiator's life was one lived on the very edge of society and survival. He was a slave who could be more famous than a senator, a condemned man who could become a folk hero, and a social outcast who could be the object of elite desire. It was a life of brutal realities and improbable dreams, lived and fought under the watchful and often fickle gaze of Rome. For centuries, the gladiator stood as the ultimate symbol of Roman power and public spectacle. But no institution, no matter how deeply ingrained in the fabric of a society, lasts forever. As the Roman Empire itself began to undergo profound and irreversible changes, so too did the fate of the arena and the men who fought and died within its walls. The final act in the gladiator's long and bloody story was drawing to a close. The most significant force behind the decline of the games was the rise of a new faith, Christianity. As this religion spread from a persecuted sect to the official faith of the empire, its core moral teachings stood in stark and irreconcilable opposition to the bloodshed of the arena. Christian leaders and writers vehemently condemned the games, viewing them as a form of pagan human sacrifice and a celebration of cruelty that was an offense to a merciful God. This represented a fundamental shift in the empire's values, where a traditional Roman might have seen courage, discipline, and martial virtue in the spectacle of the fight. A Christian saw only sin and brutality. The act of killing for public entertainment was no longer a glorious tradition that honored the dead or celebrated victory. It was seen as a source of profound moral pollution for all who watched. The very soul of the empire was changing. Alongside this moral revolution, a powerful economic reality was taking hold. The later Roman Empire was beset by immense financial crises, constant barbarian invasions, and crippling civil wars. The enormous cost of staging the gladiatorial games, of capturing exotic animals, maintaining the colossal arenas, and supporting the expensive training schools, became an unsustainable luxury for emperors and cities struggling with empty treasuries. The end came in stages. Over the course of more than a century, The first Christian emperor, Constantine, issued edicts discouraging the games in the early 4th century, but the tradition was too popular to die quickly. The final official ban on gladiatorial combat in the city of Rome is often credited to the Emperor Honorius. Around the year 404 AD, legend tells that the ban was prompted by the martyrdom of a monk named Telemachus, who was stoned to death by the angry crowd for trying to step between two fighting gladiators. Though the real arenas fell silent, their stone tiers crumbling into ruins over the centuries, the figure of the gladiator never truly vanished from the human imagination. He became a figure of history and legend, his story retold and reinterpreted by each new generation. He has been portrayed as a symbol of brutal oppression, a romantic hero, a rebel fighting against tyranny, and the ultimate embodiment of a noble struggle against impossible odds. The sand of the Colosseum has long since settled, covered now by grass and wildflowers. But the image of the gladiator remains. It is an image of profound contradiction, of a slave who was a star, of a brutal sport that was treated as high art, and of an empire that celebrated its own vitality by glorifying death. Their true victory, perhaps, was not survival in the arena, but a kind of immortality, an echo of their story that still resonates 2,000 years later. While the gladiators' fight was a spectacle of manufactured combat, designed for entertainment, ancient Rome had another, even grander public performance reserved for celebrating real-world victory. This was not a game, but the highest and most sacred honor a military commander could ever hope to achieve. This was the Roman triumph. A triumph was far more than a simple victory parade. It was a magnificent civil and religious ceremony, in which the Senate granted a victorious general the right to march his army, his prisoners, and his spoils of war through the heart of Rome in a grand procession. For that single glorious day, the general, known as the Triumphator, was elevated to a status near that of a living god, embodying the power and divine favor of Rome itself. This honor was not granted lightly. The Roman Senate guarded the right to a triumph with fierce jealousy, viewing it as the ultimate prize of the state. Many successful and celebrated generals campaigned for years, winning significant battles and expanding the empire's borders, yet never received this final, ultimate validation of their glory. To be awarded a triumph was to have your name etched into the very soul of Roman history. To even be considered for this honor, a general had to meet a rigid set of demanding criteria. First and foremost, the victory had to be overwhelming and conclusive, effectively ending a major war. This was not an honor for winning a single battle, but for utterly crushing a foreign enemy and securing a lasting peace. Crucially, triumphs were only for victories against foreign foes. Success in a civil war against fellow Romans was a source of sorrow, not celebration. Furthermore, the victory had to be a bloody one. By ancient tradition, a general was required to have slain at least 5,000 of the enemy in a single engagement. This grim statistic had to be verified and formally reported back to the Senate. Anything less was considered a minor skirmish, unworthy of the city's most magnificent and expensive celebration. The commander also had to hold the correct legal authority. He had to be the supreme commander in that theater of war, holding the state's official power or imperium. A victory won by a subordinate officer, no matter how brilliant, legally belonged to their commander-in-chief. This ensured that the glory and the immense political power that came with it remained concentrated in the hands of Rome's most powerful figures. Even if a general met all these stringent military and legal conditions, the final grant of a triumph was a political battle, fought not with swords, but with words in the halls of the Senate. Ambitious rivals could seek to block the honor out of jealousy or fear of a commander's growing popularity. Winning the war on the battlefield was only the first step. The second, and sometimes harder, step was winning the war of politics back in Rome. Once the political battles in the Senate were won and the formal decree was finally given, the entire city of Rome would begin to stir with a palpable sense of anticipation. The morning of a triumph was unlike any other day. It was an unofficial public holiday that began long before the sun rose, with a current of excitement that seemed to flow through the very stones and streets of the capital. Rome would awaken to the smell of wood smoke, roasting food from street vendors, and the sweet, heavy scent of incense burned on makeshift altars. The city's normally chaotic streets, which would typically be filled with the clatter of merchants' carts, were swept clean and adorned with garlands of flowers and fresh laurel leaves. From the poorest tenements of the Suburra to the grandest villas on the Palatine Hill, people poured into the city, eager to find the best vantage point along the designated triumphal route. Families would claim their spots on balconies or rooftops, parents hoisting sleepy children onto their shoulders for a better view. Old veterans, their own campaign days long past, would stand a little straighter, their eyes searching for the familiar eagle standards of the legions they had once served. For this one day, the entire city paused its business, its quarrels, and its routines, united in a shared sense of civic pride and raw spectacle. The procession itself would assemble on the Campus Martis, the field of Mars, which lay just outside the city's sacred boundary. Here, the victorious army gathered. Legionaries dressed in their finest parade armor polished their shields one last time. The vast spoils of war, chests of gold, captured armor, and foreign statues were arranged on ornate wagons, and the most high-ranking prisoners were brought forth, their grim faces a stark contrast to the festive mood. Meanwhile, in a nearby tent, the general himself, the triumphator, would undergo a sacred transformation. He would exchange his standard military attire for the traditional triumphal garb, a magnificent purple toga embroidered with gold thread, mimicking the attire of Rome's ancient kings. A crown of fresh laurel, the symbol of victory, was placed on his head. Most strikingly, his face was painted a deep vermilion red, in imitation of the revered terracotta statue of Jupiter, the king of the gods. For this day, he was not just a mortal man, he was the living embodiment of divine favor. As the first horns blared a sharp, piercing note, a great roar would swell from the waiting city. The moment had arrived. The vast column of soldiers, prisoners, and wagons would begin to move, marching towards the Porta Triumphalis, a ceremonial gate in the city wall that was opened only for this sacred occasion. As the front of the procession passed through its archway, the city of Rome seemed to hold its collective breath, ready to receive its victorious sons. The triumph was not just passing through the city, it was consuming it. For the next several hours, the normal, bustling life of Rome would cease to exist, replaced by a single, flowing river of sound, color, and overwhelming glory. A spectacle meticulously designed to be remembered for generations to come. As the head of the great procession passed through the triumphal gate and into the packed and roaring streets of Rome, the first wave of the spectacle began. Long before the victorious general or his legions came into view. The crowd was treated to the grand opening act of this rolling play, the awe-inspiring display of the spoils of war. This was a carefully orchestrated exhibition of overwhelming wealth, designed to dazzle and impress every citizen of Rome. On hundreds of heavy wagons, and carried aloft on the shoulders of sweating porters, came the plundered treasures of the defeated nation. There were heaped chests of gold and silver coins, ornate statues torn from foreign temples, and piles of gleaming, exotic armor. Intricately woven tapestries and royal garments were draped over floats for all to admire. But this was far more than just a display of riches. It was a visual narrative of the victory itself. Large painted panels, like giant moving storyboards, were carried along by soldiers, depicting key moments from the war. The dramatic storming of a fortress, a decisive cavalry charge, or the solemn surrender of the enemy king. In an era before any form of mass media, this was how a general showed the people back home exactly what he and his army had accomplished. Adding to the sense of wonder and the exoticism of the victory were the captured animals. These were creatures that most Romans had only ever heard of in myths and travelers' tales, now paraded through their own streets. There might be towering elephants from Africa, sleek leopards from the east, or massive bears from the northern forests, either herded along or confined in rolling cages. These living trophies were tangible proof of how far Rome's power now extended. The symbols of the enemy's own military might were also put on display, but now as objects of utter humiliation. Captured military standards, the ceremonial crowns and scepters of foreign kings, and great piles of broken shields and swords were all paraded as proof of the enemy's complete and total defeat. Sometimes, even the statues of the conquered people's gods were carried along, a silent testament to the superiority of Rome's own deities. As this seemingly endless river of plunder flowed past, the crowd would roar its approval. For the average Roman citizen, this was the tangible fruit of empire. It was proof that the taxes they paid and the soldiers they sent to distant lands had resulted in security, glory, and a tidal wave of new wealth pouring directly into their city. It was a powerful, shared experience of national triumph. This overwhelming display of material conquest was designed to fully intoxicate the city with the sheer scale of the victory. But as the last wagon of gold rumbled past, the mood of the crowd would often begin to shift, because the next part of the procession was the most human, and in many ways the most chilling and captivating of all. After the dazzling, almost overwhelming spectacle of gold, silver, and exotic treasures, the tone of the great procession would subtly shift. The exuberant cheers of the crowd might soften, mingled now with a mix of awe, pity, and cruelty. For now came the darkest, most human, and most compelling part of the entire triumph, the prisoners of war. No amount of plundered gold could make a victory feel as real to the Roman people as the sight of the defeated enemy walking in chains through their own city streets. These were not abstract figures from a painted placard. They were the living, breathing embodiment of the nation that had dared to challenge Roman might. In the eyes of Rome, they were the ultimate and most valuable trophies of the campaign. Leading this grim column were the most important captives of all, the defeated king or queen, their generals, and often their children. They were deliberately forced to march in their finest royal robes, not as a sign of respect, but to make their humiliation all the more profound and visually striking. The crowd could now look upon the faces of the very people whose power their victorious legions had utterly broken. Behind the captive royal family shuffled the seemingly endless ranks of captured enemy soldiers, their heads bowed low, their hands bound in heavy iron chains. The rhythmic, mournful clanking of their shackles provided a somber soundtrack to this part of the parade. Each captive was a walking symbol of Roman martial superiority, a testament to the discipline and overwhelming strength of the triumphant army. The Roman crowd was rarely merciful in these moments. They would hurl insults, jeer, and mock the defeated prisoners as they passed. For the citizens of Rome, many of whom may have lost sons, brothers, or husbands in the war being celebrated, this was a moment of raw, cathartic justice. It was a visceral display of dominance over those who had once been a formidable and deadly threat to their city and their way of life. While most of the common prisoners would be sold into slavery after the triumph, their lives of hardship continuing in Roman quarries or households, a far darker fate awaited the highest-ranking captive. At the conclusion of the day's ceremonies, the defeated enemy leader was often taken to a prison at the foot of the Capitoline Hill and ritually strangled. Their death was the final, brutal punctuation mark on Rome's absolute victory. This somber parade of defeated humanity served a crucial theatrical purpose. It was a powerful and unforgettable reminder of the grave threat that had been vanquished. And as the last of the prisoners shuffled past, the energy of the crowd would begin to build once more, their eyes turning expectantly down the sacred way, ready at last to receive the man responsible for it all, the triumphant general himself. After the displays of inanimate wealth and the somber parade of defeated enemies, a great wave of sound would travel up the procession's route, growing louder with each passing moment. This was the climax of the entire spectacle, the arrival of the figure at the very center of this grand universe of victory. The triumphator himself, the victorious general, was about to appear. He did not march on foot with his men. The triumphator rode in a magnificent chariot, a quadriga drawn by 4 stunning white horses moving in perfect unison. Their manes were braided with ribbons, and their harnesses gleamed with polished bronze and silver fittings. The chariot itself was a work of art, gilded and ornately carved with scenes from mythology and the recent campaigns, designed to catch the sunlight and dazzle the eyes of every spectator. Standing tall and alone in the chariot was the general, transformed for this one day into a being of almost divine status. He wore the toga picta, a heavy purple robe richly embroidered with gold thread, a color traditionally associated with Rome's highest gods and ancient kings. On his head was the simple, potent victor's laurel crown, and his face was painted a striking vermilion, linking him directly to the image of the supreme god, Jupiter, Optimus, Maximus. Yet, in a powerful and uniquely Roman display of caution against excessive pride, he did not ride entirely alone. Standing directly behind him in the same chariot was a slave, owned by the state. This slave's sole duty for the day was to hold a heavy golden crown above the general's head and repeatedly whisper in his ear a humbling, grounding reminder, memento mori, remember that you are mortal. It was a way to temper the day's godlike glory with a dose of human reality. As his chariot rolled past, the crowd would erupt into a thunderous, ecstatic roar. They would throw flowers in his path, their petals immediately crushed under the chariot's wheels and the horses' hooves. They would chant his name over and over, waving small laurel branches and cheering until their voices grew hoarse. This was their hero, the man who had brought them security and glory, and their adoration in this moment was absolute. In a touch of personal and political theater, the triumphator's young children were sometimes allowed to ride with him in the great chariot, or on the trace horses alongside it. This served to both humanize the great conqueror in the eyes of the people, and to present his family and his legacy to Rome, subtly suggesting a future dynasty of greatness for the state. For these few hours, the triumphant general was more than a man. He was the living symbol of Rome's divine destiny and its unstoppable military might. He was the focal point of an entire city's pride and gratitude, a mortal who was permitted, just for one day, to stand on the very threshold of godhood, all while being constantly reminded that the glory of today would inevitably fade. Following the magnificent chariot of the triumphator came the heart and soul of his victory, the living engine that had made this entire day possible. This was not just the general's triumph. In a very real sense, it was theirs as well. Rank upon disciplined rank of his victorious legionaries marched into the city, their rhythmic, hobnailed steps echoing on the paving stones of the sacred way. These were the men who had endured the blistering heat, the freezing cold, and the sheer terror of the long campaign. For this day, their battered, campaign-worn gear was set aside. They marched in polished parade armor that gleamed in the Italian sun. Many wore simple crowns of laurel, just like their general, and were adorned with military decorations, silver medallions known as filari, and ornate neckrings called torques, awarded for individual acts of bravery on the battlefield. Held high above them, catching the light, were the sacred standards of the legions, the golden or silver eagles, the aquilae. Their wings spread wide, seemed to survey the adoring crowds with a regal gaze. To a Roman, these were not just decorative symbols. They were the very spirit of the legion, objects of intense veneration that had been carried deep into enemy territory and brought back home in glory. In a fascinating break from the norm, by ancient tradition, the soldiers were allowed to sing boisterous, often crude and satirical songs as they marched, a socially acceptable release of pent-up energy and emotion. These songs often took aim directly at their own triumphant general, mocking him for his personal habits, his supposed greed, or, in the famous case of Julius Caesar, his baldness. It was a strange and wonderful custom where the common soldier could publicly and harmlessly tease the man who otherwise held the power of life and death over them. This ritualized mockery was thought to deflect the envy of the gods and remind the triumphator of his own humanity. The presence of thousands of loyal, battle-hardened soldiers marching through the capital was also an undeniable and powerful political statement. It was a visible reminder to the Senate and to any of the general's rivals that his glory was not just ceremonial. It was backed by a formidable and devoted military force. The army's loyalty could make or break any political career in Rome. And so, with their irreverent songs echoing through the marble canyons of the city, the army followed its commander. They were the final, living piece of the grand procession, the foundation upon which the entire victory was built. Their steady march was taking them, and all of Rome, towards the final, sacred destination of the day's long and glorious journey. The great temple that stood waiting at the top of the Capitoline Hill, the spiritual and religious center of the Roman world. The final, steep climb to the summit would slow the entire parade, the horses straining and the soldiers' steps growing heavier. building the tension for the last and most important act of the day. At the top stood the magnificent temple of Jupiter, Optimus, Maximus, the greatest of the gods and the divine protector of Rome. Here, the triumphator would finally dismount from his glorious chariot, shedding his temporary godlike status to approach the temple's great bronze doors on foot. He was no longer a living god, but a mortal man, a servant of the state, coming to give thanks. He would lay his victor's laurel crown and a symbolic portion of the richest spoils at the feet of the colossal seated statue of Jupiter. This was the ultimate gesture, symbolically offering the entire victory to the gods who were believed to have granted it. At the same time, on the great altar outside, pure white oxen were sacrificed, their blood sealing the pact between Rome and its divine protectors. And often, in the shadow of this sacred moment, a final, brutal act of justice took place. The captive enemy leader, who had been paraded through the streets for all to see, was quietly taken to a nearby prison at the foot of the hill and ritually executed. The formal announcement of his death, sent up to the temple, signified that the war was now truly and irreversibly over. With the gods honored and the enemies of Rome vanquished, the formal triumph would dissolve into a citywide celebration. The general would often host lavish public banquets, using the spoils of war to feast the populace for days. He would pay his soldiers the generous bonuses he had promised them on campaign, and sometimes sponsor several days of public games in the circus or the arena, ensuring his victory would be remembered for its generosity and joy. But the triumph, for all its unparalleled grandeur, was a fleeting moment. The next day, the general was once again a mere citizen of Rome, the red paint washed from his face, his purple toga carefully stored away. He was mortal again, and as our own long journey through the spectacles of punishment and glory comes to a close for tonight, the echoes of those ancient cheers and solemn chants begin to fade into the quiet, law and memory throughout our history. I hope this journey into the past has been a quiet and calming companion for you. If you have enjoyed our time together, please consider subscribing to Medieval Nocturnes so you do not miss our future explorations. For now, let these stories recede and allow the peace of the night to take their place. Thank you for listening. Sleep well.